Hi everyone. In this video we're going to discuss scope of our dynamic web applications. So when I say the word scope in programming, what I mean is where things are visible or how accessible they are or where they're accessible. There's quite a few scopes within our dynamic web applications, four to be clear. And this scope is very similar to the temporary scope or local scope of the session object right here. So this session object has a local scope. Again, it is created when doGet is called, and when doGet ends on line 41, it is immediately deleted, and this object is forgotten about. Likewise, we have a class scope, and this object would now exist for the lifetime of this session servlet object, so it would stay around in RAM. So same idea as class and local scope. We have four different scopes. Now, I'm going to delete some of the code I made in the previous video here. So, just a quick note about scope. We have, again, four different types. We have what's known as the very lowest scope, which would be known as page scope. And page scope would be the variables that are only accessible on this JSP page. That would be the scope of this page. We also have one step up from that is what's known as the request scope, or variables that are accessible from the request object. Likewise, we also have session scope, which is accessible from the session object that's being tracked as users move about the website. And then finally, we have application scope. So we'll take a look at all three scope levels. And then the page scope I'm not going to really dive into too much. So to demonstrate scope, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a request attribute. Do request.setAttribute. And I'm liking message, so I'm going to name that attribute message, and we'll set that equal to request scoped. We'll say request scoped attribute. And put a little hyphen in there. Okay. The way we can access this attribute on the JSP side of things is we can use some expression language, so that would be $, and then some curly braces, and I could type in message. Now, if I click play, I should see that attribute appear. I should see the value of that attribute appear. Indeed, we see the message request scoped attribute. Now, a little conundrum for you. If I type in session.setAttribute, again, we're pulling this session out of the request object. If I set a session attribute called message equal to session scoped attribute, which is the one we'll use? Again, one of these attributes is scoped just within the request object and then immediately forgotten about. This message is within the session object and is maintained for, I think, 15 minutes is what we set it for in our server-side memory. But I have two messages with the same name. So I'm going to rerun this. Let's see which one wins, which one gets displayed. It is the request scoped attribute that wins. Even though I have two attributes with the same name, the request attribute is the one that's winning. Now, if I comment this out and I relaunch this website, we should see the session attribute appear. And again, we see the session scoped attribute. Now, here's the thing. What if I want to use, why you would do this, I'm not sure. But what if I want to keep both of these messages around? They're both there in this JSP file. We just have to do a little more work to access them. So what we can do is we can actually type in request scope dot message to access request scoped attributes. Likewise, we can do session scope dot message to access attributes on the session object, and it is recommended that you do request dot the attribute name, session dot, and then the attribute name. So now if I run this, I should see both attributes appear on our JSP file. And again, that's how we can differentiate between the different scoped attributes. Same name, just different scopes. Likewise, there is actually an application level scope, so attributes that would be available to all servlets and everything throughout the entire application. And the way you get that guy is with request.getServletContext. This will return a servlet context object. And so just to make sure, yeah, it returns a servlet context object. I'm going to call it servlet context. Attributes set in the servlet context object will be available to everything. So again, we need to import the servlet context object. And likewise, just like with attributes, or session attributes or request attributes, I can do servlet context.set attribute. Give them a name, we'll give it the name message. And then we can say application scoped attribute. And what we can do then is we should be able to access the application level attributes as well. And I think it's application scope dot message. Kind of spacing. I hope I named the. I hope I have that correct. Otherwise, we'll use some Google Foo to figure it out. Indeed, we see. Got it right. That's good. So we have these attributes that are set at the different scope levels. There's request scoped attributes, session scoped attributes, and application scoped attributes. And again, you could access these attributes. This set attribute, this would be for the whole website. This guy would be just from that session that gets passed around per user. This one's just passed around per quest. And so those are kind of the main three scopes. The final scope is what's known as the page scope. And again, those are just variables that are scoped within this page. So for instance, I believe if we made a message variable using C, JSTL, we could create a variable that would have the page scope. So it would have the same message name, but it would be under page scope. So really that's it to dynamic website scoping. Again, we have 4 different scopes. We have the scope within the page itself. We have the scope per each request object. We have the scope for each session object that follows each user. And then we have the application scope, the scope that's available throughout the whole website. So if there was some message you want to display across the entire website for every user across every GSP, you could then set the application scoped message. So again, that's kind of all there is to attributes and scope. Again, if you have any questions on sessions, requests, the application level scopes, or whatever, don't hesitate. Come let me know and I'll help you out. Thanks for watching.